Hello there guys, we are going to do some stuff today on food chains and food webs. To start with, we're going to try and get you guys thinking a bit about science and start with a do now. If you've got, make sure you've got yourselves a pen or a pencil and some paper to write down any answers to these questions. I would like you to pause the video and have a go at each of those questions. These are your answers. Again, if you want to pause the video and give yourselves the time to correct and mark those answers for me, please. So in this session, I previously mentioned that we'll be looking at things like food webs and food chains. Now I'm just going to start with a quick introductory video to start with, okay? Now our objectives from this video is that students will be able to describe what a food web is, and students will be able to explain why knowledge of food webs is important. Now, you should have a pen and a pencil from doing the do now. It might be a good idea to write some notes down as we're kind of going through, and also to make sure you've got something to write on to answer some of the questions later on in the video. Now, you've probably covered things like food chains, maybe from primary school, but if you haven't, we're going to start with a recap of those first. We've got some keywords, and there's quite a few keywords there to be thinking of. However, these are the only keywords that you're going to need for the next couple of videos. So I'll have them on each of the subsequent videos so you can kind of refer to them. But these are the kind of things I'm going to be talking about. So obviously we're going to be talking about food webs and food chains. But I want to draw your attention to the bottom three: producer, consumer, and decomposer. We'll be talking about those a little bit in today's video. Now, I've got three food chains there to kind of give you an idea of the things that we're talking about. Now, each food chain is more complicated than the one just before it. So the one at the very top talks about corn, a rat, and an owl. Now, I've labelled each of those three animals, or organisms, with what we would call them within a food chain or a food web. So the first one, the beginning of every single food chain or food web, always starts with something that we call a producer. Now, they are normally plants that do something like photosynthesis to produce their own energy. Now, producers start off the food chain. They will be eaten by what we call consumers. If it eats something else, it's a consumer. So, for example, something like a grasshopper right at the bottom, or a rabbit or a rat, they are all consumers. Now, a food chain won't just start with them. Sorry, won't finish with those. They will be the first of the consumers. So we call them the primary consumers. The consumer that comes after them would then be called the secondary. The third consumer would be called the tertiary consumer. And then if there is a fourth consumer, there isn't very often a fourth consumer, they will either be called the apex predator or the quaternary consumer. Normally apex predator's fine. It doesn't often go any higher than the tertiary consumer though. Now these arrows are important as well. The direction that those arrows go in must be showing the direction that energy is being transferred through that food chain. If it's facing the other way, the energy doesn't go down. An owl does not give energy to the rat, and the rat does not give energy to the corn. It's the other way around. The rats will get energy from the corn by eating it, and the owl will get energy from the rats by eating the rat. So that direction of the arrow is very important. It must always be going up the food chain or the food web. Now, food chains are too simple. They don't really show the complex chains of energy going through an ecosystem. So our next slide will give us a more in-depth look at what we mean by that. Now, a food web kind of puts together several different food chains to kind of show that relationship. It's very unlikely that a single living thing will only eat one other organism. For example, if we look at the grasshopper within that food web, that has two different sources of food. Now, this can be quite important because if one of those sources suddenly dies out for some reason, let's say that there aren't any grains left because they've been eaten by the birds, then the grasshopper has at least got something else that it can feast on or feed on. Without that, then the grasshopper would be in serious trouble. And that's often the same for our apex predators. Our predators that are at the top of food webs or food chains will normally have 2 or 3 different sources of food to consume. If something happened to rabbits, the foxes can at least eat birds instead to mean they don't starve to death. So it's really important for food webs. And this shows the complex relationship between them. Now, it's important that we understand food webs because it will allow us to predict changes to a population, to the number of foxes, for example, by looking at what would happen to the animals that they eat or the organisms that they eat. So food webs can be very important for predicting the effects of damage to an environment. Now, I would like to have a look at the activity that you'll find in the Dropbox, Activity 1. I'd like to spend about 5–10 minutes attempting that activity. And then there's also the answers on there somewhere as well for you to mark your work. So pause the video here and have a go at that activity for me, please. Once you've completed that activity, there is also an exam question for you to have a look at as well, looking at some of the knowledge that we've focused on today. So again, pause this video, have a look at that exam question, and then mark it for me. And that's all we're really going to look at today. Some final thoughts is that food webs are important for predicting changes to a species population. So we want to be able to predict some damage that might happen if, for example, grasshoppers were wiped out or something like that. There are some questions to accompany this as well that I would like you to complete on Educake that will kind of help recap and test your knowledge on this. Feel free to look back through the video at any point to help you with some of that. Thank you very much.